What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Blood on the Razor Wire TV. Today we're going to give you some of Tommy Silverstein's words. Words that, he didn't tell everybody. Words that he gave to one person in particular, a friend, a journalist. And those words are going to come from the book No Human Contact. We're going to read a little bit of this today. Not a very long video, but a little something, right? But I want you to think and reflect, as I read on this story and what this story is all about. This story's about torture. You ever imagine what it would be like to be locked in a cell? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The lights are always on. Everybody that surrounds you hates you. They make jokes about you and they tell you, hey, Jesus loves you. He's the only one. People are going to respond and say, but, he killed a cop in prison and he killed some other people and he was a vicious gang member. And I understand all that. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, when is enough enough? What does prison do to you? What is it like to be locked in a cell like that? What does it do to you mentally and emotionally? And what about the staff members when they're all together? They're all integrated together and they all have a common plan or purpose. And that is to fuck you. Literally. It's in more ways than one. The psychologist who's supposed to be impartial. Well, he lives in that neighborhood and these are his friends that he sees at the grocery store. He's never going to recommend that, solitary confinement's destroying you. And back then they wouldn't ever write what's really going on, would they? No, of course not. Why would they? So we're going to get into his story. We're going to talk a little bit about, the Birdman of Alcatraz and how history just repeats itself and how vicious things are. So let's get into it. Blood on the Razor Wire TV. I realized I was the latest victim of brutality imposed by pious prison-crats who took joy in seeing prisoners suffer. In the fall of 1988, Silverstein mailed a packet containing a dog-eared copy of Birdman of Alcatraz to a friend along with a letter. Read this. Nothing has changed in this hellhole called Leavenworth. The paperback had been delivered to him in his basement cell with a sticky note attached to its jacket by someone at the prison. Take to the dog, it read. Written by Thomas E. Gaddis in 1955, the book had become a popular 1962 movie that had glamorized inmate Robert Stroud's life. Silverstein had riddled the book with tiny notes written in its margins comparing what was happening to him with what Stroud had experienced decades earlier in a Leavenworth solitary confinement cell. Stroud was supposed to be hanged after he fatally stabbed a Leavenworth guard in 1916, but his mother persuaded President Woodrow Wilson to commute her son's sentence to life. The U.S. Attorney General ordered Stroud held in solitary confinement for the rest of his days. Stroud discovered 3 injured sparrows in the prison yard one day and took them back to his cell to nurse. At the time, the Bureau allowed inmates to keep birds as pets. Stroud began collecting and studying birds in his cell, eventually raising more than 300 canaries and writing an authoritative book, Diseases of Canaries, which was smuggled out of Leavenworth and published in 1933. Stroud's medical discoveries were groundbreaking, and he soon was operating a thriving bird-selling business from his isolation cell. He received so many letters that the warden was forced to hire a full-time secretary to monitor his correspondence. Angry at Stroud's notoriety, the warden decided to take Stroud's birds away, but was stopped when a fellow bird researcher named Della Mae Jones tipped off newspapers and delivered a petition signed by 50,000 to the White House. Flummoxed, the warden next tried to transfer Stroud to a different penitentiary, one that didn't allow birds. But Stroud outsmarted him by marrying Jones and citing a Kansas law that prohibited married Kansas prisoners from being moved out of state. Eventually, Stroud was caught using scientific equipment to make alcohol and was sent to Alcatraz in 1941. His birds were turned over to his brother. In 1959, with his health failing, Stroud was transferred to the Springfield Medical Center, where he died 4 years later at age 73. He'd been in prison 54 years, including 42 years in and out of solitary confinement. In the book's margin on page 28, Silverstein would write, "Please note that when his old lady finally got to see him, she noticed he had dead eyes. And when the Bureau decided to no longer let him write to her, supposedly for his own good, he developed a no longer given a fuck attitude. That's what happens when everything is taken away from you." On page 90, Silverstein commented on how caged canary males would try to make love to other males when no female birds were available. How many free men know what it is like to go without a woman year in and year out, having to fight off other males who want to fuck you? I doubt most guys even think of other males as sexual partners until they come to prison and have to be without a female. Then that old butthole starts looking better by the minute. This will continue until our keepers start making joints more like life on the outside, rather than cages and human zoos. Next to a paragraph that described how 2 convicted killers had chewed bird food, softening it so starving baby canaries could swallow it, Silverstein wrote, "Even the worst of the worst can be tender and caring if given a chance. The problem is, prisons are more concerned about punishing people than trying to solve what got them into trouble. My sentiments exactly when Stroud quotes George Bernard Shaw. If you are to punish a man, retributively, you must injure him. If you are to reform him, you must improve him. And men are not improved by injuries." Silverstein scribbled a final comment near the book's end. "I feel exactly the same way as author Gaddis wrote. Now that I am in similar shoes as Stroud, in one sense Robert Stroud's battle has long since been won. His goal has been to survive and endure. He will be known long after his keepers are one more dusty statistic in an archive." And Silverstein wrote in a letter, "Stroud was locked up in Leavenworth decades ago, and all the wardens and guards who persecuted him are dead. But they have been replaced by men who are doing to me in Leavenworth today what they did to him. It is as if we are stuck, each playing our assigned roles, repeating history over and over, without anyone stopping to say, hey, maybe it's not us, but our brutal prison system fucking up everyone." Leavenworth warden Robert Matthews visited Silverstein each week in the basement to hear his complaints. One day, Silverstein said, he couldn't read copies of his mail that were being delivered to him. All of Silverstein's letters were read and copied to ensure that they didn't contain secret messages from the Aryan Brotherhood. The copies given him weren't legible. Matthews promised to look into it. Silverstein didn't believe him, but the next day, his mail arrived on time, and he was able to read each photocopy. Matthews had told his administrative staff the night before, "He is the only special inmate we have here, and I don't want him sending copies of his letters to some judge or court and getting us in trouble. Regardless of what he has done, we must accommodate him." After 3 months with no art materials, Silverstein was allowed colored pencils and a sketch pad. 9 months later, he was able to buy oil paint, brushes, and canvases. His anger didn't dissipate. "I'm supposed to walk around like everything is cool and act like it ain't personal. Like they are just doing their job by keeping the lights on 24 hours a day, and they don't really mean anything by not letting me go out into the sunshine. I'm not supposed to have hard feelings against them? Well, fuck that. It's personal, and always will be," he would write. As in Atlanta, Silverstein was especially spiteful toward the prison psychologist, who was required to check on him once a month. During one of their visits, Silverstein lashed out. "If I killed myself down here and people came in here to investigate, I mean normal thinking people, not the sick ones you hire to work here, they'd say, why did you leave him down there locked up alone so long? Aren't you the shrink? Don't you know keeping a man in a cage all day with lights on and without any other people around is really sick? What are you going to tell them, Doc? How are you going to justify this?" In his monthly report, the psychologist wrote, "Silverstein voiced no problems or complaints of psychological nature. He is well organized in his thought content and appears to be doing well. Showing no sign of debilitating emotional distress, which would warrant a change in his housing at this time. He appears to be in relatively good spirits. His hygiene and general attitude appear to reflect a satisfactory level of adjustment of his status. He is not viewed as a threat to himself at this time." Silverstein said later, "That shrink had no idea what happens to a man locked up like I am, and his response was that he had the guards lock him in the hole for an hour, and he didn't experience any negative effects, which shows how out of touch most of these folks are with their subject matter. I told him, you're trying to sit in here for 10 or 15 years, and then tell me if it's had zero effect on you. I get so sick of these spoiled brats who come in here a few hours a day from their lily-white neighborhoods with their privileged upbringings, telling those of us in cages how we should react. I said, all your shrink bullshit ends on this side of these bars. What would you do if we changed places? And a guy came up and said, I like your watch, give it to me. Knowing if you did, he'd come back the next day and say, hey, I want your butthole. Bend over and spread them. All your psychological bullshit wouldn't mean squat. All your education means nothing. You're either going to hand over your watch, surrender your butthole, suck his dick, or fight and get the worst beating in your life. After that happened, how would you feel if a shrink showed up in his expensive suit with his notebook and looked through the bars at you and said, let's talk about your anger management problem? Officers noticed Silverstein had printed the word freedom in capital letters on the wall of his stainless steel shower stall in the grime built up there. They ordered him to clean it. Can, he replied. I don't have any hot water to use to clean it. No one had switched on the hot water valve into his cell. The officer said it was an oversight, but his contempt for them kept him from believing it had been an innocent mistake. He wrote a friend. They gave me hot water after the writer interviewing me for his book mentioned it to the warden Matthews. He'd caught them. One afternoon, Silverstein was handed a letter from a woman who the Bureau had banned from writing him. He'd not heard from Shannon Smith for 6 years, and he immediately assumed her letter had slipped by the Leavenworth official monitoring his mail. He wrote back and was delighted that his letter reached her. He decided a new employee must have been put in charge of reading his letters and not been aware of the ban. The Bureau had been blocking Smith's letters because officials suspected she lied about her past. Smith had been an investigator in the Kansas City Public Defender's Office in 1979 when Danny Atwell was murdered, and she assisted defense attorney David Phillips in defending Silverstein. She was able to visit Silverstein regularly and had become smitten. After Silverstein was transferred to Marion's control unit, Smith continued to keep in touch, and the two of them arranged a secret sexual liaison. This was before Silverstein murdered Officer Klutz and was put into isolation. Their trials happened when Silverstein was subpoenaed as a potential defense witness in an Aryan Brotherhood murder trial in California. Smith flew to Los Angeles and drove to the jail where he was being held. Flashing her federal public defender credentials, Smith was able to meet Silverstein in an attorney-client room. Meetings with attorneys and their assistants are private. I was a young, horny woman, and he was a horny inmate, she candidly recalled, later during a tape-recorded interview. How else can I explain it? Smith returned home and reported to work at the defender's office without anyone catching on. When Silverstein was taken back to Marion, Smith called the prison to arrange an attorney-client visit. By chance, the chief public defender for the Kansas City region was in Marion interviewing a prisoner, and he learned about her request. The public defender's office was no longer representing Silverstein, so when the chief defender questioned her, Smith admitted that she was in love with Tommy Silverstein. She was fired, but that wasn't enough to stop her from trying to visit him. Smith asked to be put on Silverstein's visit list. Under BOP rules, Silverstein could only have people who knew him before February 15, 1978, when he began serving his federal bank robbery sentence. Visit him. To skirt that restriction, Smith claimed on her application that she met Silverstein in 1968, when she was 27 years old and he was 16 years old. I was at Huntington Beach with a friend and saw this guy surfing with his cousins and thought, my God, he is good looking. We ended up partying that night and spent the night on the beach together. I just considered it a one-night encounter at the time. She hadn't thought about Silverstein again until she started working on the Atwell murder case, she said. She hadn't told anyone about their beach liaison because she would have been kicked off his defense team. The BOP didn't believe her story, and her former boss, the chief public defender, asked the U.S. Attorney's Office in Kansas City to charge her with making a false statement on a government form. Smith wasn't charged, but in 1982, the Bureau banned her from writing to him. Under BOP regulations, whenever a letter was rejected, the prisoner was notified. So Silverstein knew each time she wrote him, even though her letters were returned and he was forbidden to correspond with her. When we began writing again, we picked up right where we'd left off, he recalled. Smith said later, I knew we were not going to run away and get married, but I loved him and cared for him, and I will always care for him. If he'd escaped, he would have been at my doorstep and the authorities would have surrounded the house, but I wouldn't have made him leave. He was my man. No longer kept from writing, Silverstein and Smith exchanged dozens of passionate love letters without any of them being intercepted until one of his missives was rejected by prison officials during the Christmas holiday. Silverstein had drawn a picture of an erect penis inside a Christmas card with the caption, What I'd love to give you for Christmas. He quickly mailed her a less graphic card. A different Christmas card was making the rounds at the prison during that same December 1988. A Leavenworth captain had made the card on the Bureau's computer and was showing it to his officers. It had a large ornate Christian cross on its cover, with a stained glass church window in the background. The cover said, For you, Tommy, a Christmas card. Jesus loves you. When opened, the card read, Everyone else thinks you're an asshole.